What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another exciting episode. Today, I've been getting a lot of questions lately about Japan bass fishing. I'm once again off of a fresh trip. If you guys saw my last two videos, they were both in Japan. And I get questions about hey, what's bass fishing actually like in Japan? Is it as hard as they say? And what kind of other styles do they have? Other lakes and all these different things. So in today's video, I kind of want to just go over my experience of bass fishing in Japan. We're mostly going to be talking about Lake Biwa, the most famous of all the lakes in Japan. The world record came out of it in 2009. A lot of giant bass come out of it. A lot of brands have kind of started and have kind of originated from Lake Biwa. And so a lot of my time is spent fishing Lake Biwa because I find Lake Biwa is the most fascinating, the lake that I feel like I want to spend most of my time fishing, and convenience sake. A lot of the friends that I have over there, a lot of the brands that I like are around Lake Biwa, and so I just spend a lot of time around Biwa. So just to start, the first time I ever got to fish Lake Biwa was March back in 2023, and that was for a pretty short period of time. I maybe fished it for like a day and a half, maybe 2 days total, but it wasn't a whole lot of time. But around that time, everybody's like, hey, March is obviously like a pre-spawn, kind of getting into that spawn phase. So a lot of those fish move from offshore into the shallow water, just like how they do here in any body of water in America. It's a bass at the end of the day where, all right, it's winter, the fish are kind of lethargic, they're deep, but then as soon as the temperature starts to go up, those fish start to think about spawning and moving shallow. And so it's the same thing there. And that trip in March, I didn't catch anything on that trip, but my buddy Matt, he ended up actually catching one. It was the first Biwa bass that I got to see with my own eyes, and it was a really cool experience. It's like, all right, hey, we have this game plan, let's go shore fish this certain section of the lake. And my buddy Matt ended up catching a pretty nice fish on the Clash 9. After him catching that fish, I was so amped and so juiced to try and catch one myself. Unfortunately, that didn't come that trip. I ended up skunking. So I was like, all right, I'll be back eventually to fish this body of water. So what ended up happening is later that year, I believe in June and July, me, Ben from the Hookup Tackle, and our other buddy CJ, we actually went to Japan to film this cool thing up in Akita, which is mainly a trout thing. But we ended up going back down south to fish Lake Biwa with the Duo Realis guys, and it was just kind of a one-day thing, and it was basically just a quick shore fishing mission. But this time it was my first time going to the northern part of the lake called Hoko, and it was cool just to see whoa, so this is what this side of the lake looks like, because in March and the time before, all the time I'd ever spent around the lake was on the South Lake. So there's two different sides of the lake to Lake Biwa. It's separated by the main bridge, and this bridge is pretty famous. That's where the world record was caught from. And so on the southern part of the bridge, they call that Nanko, or South Lake, and then obviously the North Lake is called Hoko. So two different sides, two very, very different style of fields. North Lake is kind of like a deep, clear water area with big rocks, and then the South Lake is more shallow, grassier areas, and just overall just a much shallower body of water. The fish look very different in my opinion. Like the North Lake fish, those are the fish that you see that are just super fat, short, super healthy fish. But then the South Lake fish are much longer, bigger heads, really cool dynamic on that lake. And so being able to kind of see both sides of the lake was cool, but again, I didn't catch anything. And we were just shore fishing, and it was just a lot of time spent all right, I need to actually spend a full on 8+ days fishing Lake Biwa. So I came last October to Lake Biwa, and for I think it was 8 or 9 days straight, I didn't catch a fish at all. And so it was really brutal. Shore fishing with DRT guys, fishing with Okuda Manabu. It was just another rough trip, and I was starting to get really, really bummed because those, personal trips that I take to Japan, the only thing that I really want to accomplish from it is trying to at least catch a bass and figure out the lake more. So that October trip was that first time all right, I'm spending 8+ days in a row fishing every day to try and catch a bass. And when you don't catch one, it really hurts. And you start to realize, like, okay, like, this fishing is not as easy as I thought it was going to be, or per se, in the sense of, like, I knew going into it that it was going to be hard, but this hard, I didn't think it was going to be. My buddy Phoenix, he actually ended up catching like a little 3-pounder on the Tiny Clash one of the mornings that we went out, and that was our only fish of the entire trip. He had some other action, but the only fish we caught for 8+ days of fishing was a 3-pounder, which you don't go to Lake Biwa to catch a 3-pounder. So I vowed, I said, okay, next time I swear I'm going to catch a fish. And so we waited from October until April to go back. I did go in March, but I didn't fish. I just went to keep cast, but no fishing. So I went back in April for a specific fishing trip, and that was the trip that I finally started to piece together things. But the only way I was able to piece together things was just putting my feet on the ground. And for the first, I think, 4 or 5 days, I didn't catch anything. It was super brutal. But it wasn't until the same day my buddy Phoenix, he ended up catching a 9-pounder. That was his second fish of the trip. His first fish of the trip was actually with Okudamanabu up on the northern part of the lake. And that was a really fun day. It was on like a high spot, and you got to see, like, all right, this is a North Lake fish. Just super thick, just like a beautiful, beautiful bass. And we were really stoked on that. So then, like, 2 days later, he catches a 9-pounder from shore at the southern part of the lake. And I was like, holy crap, like, this kid's on fire. He just caught an 8 a couple of days ago. And now shore fishing, he catches a 9. Like, I mean, catching an 8, when you're with Okudamanabu is really, really cool. But catching a 9 on a bite that, going into it, we kind of knew that there was fish in this particular area. We had seen them at the beginning of the trip. There was a school of, like, 29-pound plus class fish sitting in this channel mouth, but they did not look at a lure. So, we were game planning, like, all right, we should try fishing it in the evening. We should try fishing at night. We should try fishing it in the middle of the day. And then we finally settled, like, okay, we've eliminated all these things. Let's try fishing it first thing in the morning before anybody gets down there. And his first cast of the morning, he catches a 9-pound largemouth, which was absolutely unreal. And so that gave me so much more motivation to just put my feet on the ground and catch him, because I was like, well, I mean, it's biting. I just have to put in more work and effort. And so that day, I walked 15 miles that day of just a lot of the South Lake area just to try and put my feet on the ground to find new areas that I hadn't fished before. And lo and behold, after 15 miles of walking, I finally caught a bass, my first ever bass, on the Clash 9. And it was from a spot that I'd never fished before, but it made sense on paper. There was a lot of bait in the area. There was a lot of good structure and cover, and it just seemed like a pretty good area. And there wasn't a whole lot of people fishing there. So, lucked out, caught my first fish, and I was absolutely stoked. My first ever Lake Biwa fish, after so many trips and so many days of fishing that body of water just to catch one. But when I finally caught it, it felt so, so good, especially to do it Okapari style with no help from any of the local bros. Just like, all right, just like back home, when I was trying to figure out my own home lakes, the only way I found out how to fish them was to basically fish the entire lake. And obviously it takes you a very long time to do that. But you learn so much about the lakes, and you start to find things that maybe some people don't know or realize as well. So I've kind of approached that way with Lake Biwa. It's just, I don't ask for a lot of, like, hey, should I go here or should I go here? Like, I need some spots. Like, give me spots. For the most part, it's just pull up my phone, pull up Google Maps, and just, like, look at a side of a lake and be like, okay, this little canal looks good. Oh, this little point has a tree on it. I should try and fish it. And basically, how you get to those places, I don't rent a car when I go to Japan. And so basically, all I do when I go to Japan is I walk, I take a train, or I take a bus. Some days, it's all three of those things combined into one day. But that's how I kind of just get around, is you just start from point A, and at point B, and then you got to go to point C to jump on a bus. And then from point C, where you get on the bus, is you get dropped off at a train station. And from the train station, you get back to wherever your other train station is near your Airbnb. And so These are super long, hard days, but you learn a lot from these days. There's no like handouts. There's no like, oh, dude, Jeff, you should definitely go here because this is on fire right now. It's like, I just want to try and figure it out myself, and I've luckily been rewarded with it. Now, the next day after I caught that fish, I went back to that same spot, and I think within the first 10 minutes of fishing, I caught another one, and that fish came out of a tree, which was another way that I'd always wanted to catch a fish on Lake Biwa. You see a lot of those videos where, during that springtime, these guys are like inside of a tree flipping a king nine in like these little lanes, and you watch fish come up and eat your bait. I'd always wanted to catch one that way. And so that fish was really, really special to me, especially since I actually got it on GoPro. The first fish that I caught, unfortunately, I didn't have the GoPro running. The battery literally just died right before I caught it. So it is what it is. That's just a special moment I guess I'll get to have with Lake Biwa forever and ever. But the second fish, luckily, I was actually filming and got to watch that fish eat it twice. It was super sick. But that spot was a gold mine because there was a lot of bait fish called Morocco. And Morocco is a bait fish maybe around that big, very similar to the Wakasagi, where they're not really big, but they're just kind of minnow shaped. And that time of the year, the Morocco were spawning, and during the spawn, they're just like smelt that you might have, locally, where they basically beach themselves in super shallow areas, and you'll see them literally on the bank, underneath trees, on the rocks, spawning in waves, and then they get pushed out. Wave comes in, and then they spawn, and then like they go out. And so that area just had a lot of Morocco, and the bass were just absolutely chowing on them. And I think that's why I caught those two fish there. And after that, I think we had maybe a couple other days after that. No more fish. Had a couple other followers, a couple other chances, but other than that, that was it. Those were the two bites that I had that trip, and I caught them, which I was very, very thankful for. So for me, I was like, okay, like spent thousands of dollars, spend 12 days fishing at the most prime time that everybody's like, oh, you got to come in March, you got to come in April to catch two fish. A lot of people would be like, dude, that's so not worth it, especially when guys spend that amount of money, maybe even less, just to go down to like Baccarat and catch hundreds of fish and multiple giant bass. And so a lot of people ask me like, why do you do it? Why do you do it? And it's really just for the culture and for the vibes of it. I mean, there's something very special about Lake Biwa, at least to me. I absolutely have this connection with this lake, and I want to learn more about it every trip I can. And so this last trip, kind of the same deal. It's just like, all right, the lake changes throughout the year. So in March and April, the lake's at a fairly higher level because of the snow melt and all that stuff that happens during the winter. However, throughout the summer months into fall, the water drops quite a bit because of irrigation for the farmlands, for the city that's nearby. And so the water level will drop maybe about 2 feet or so. And the grass comes up like crazy. There's so much grass on that lake. Or a lot of those spots that, didn't have grass back in April that were like shallow, but still had enough depth, I couldn't fish them anymore because they were choked out with grass. And so I basically had to write off those spots. And so I fished it again. This time was late October into early November. A year ago when I went and did that first full-length trip, that was October. And it was very, very similar. So I kind of learned like, okay, last October when I came, this is how this spot looked, and it was just too grassy. So we don't have to waste time fishing that. And so then I really started to branch out, go further beyond than anything that I had fished before. And so I just ended up finding new places or places that I thought were good. And it becomes a lot more challenging when there's just that much grass and the water's a little bit lower. So a lot of the spots that I was, seeing in April and March, whereas like the water's like here, this tree is in an absolutely perfect depth, like I should be able to catch a fish. When you go to that same tree in October and November, the water is 2 foot low and there's a crap load of grass. And so you can't really fish a lot of the money juicy spots that were money and juicy just a few months prior. So you just have to approach it and look at it a lot differently. So this last trip, Okapari fishing is a style of fishing where it's basically just means shore fishing. And, shore fishing in Japan is really, really popular due to a lot of people not being able to have the luxury of having a boat in Japan. Whether they make enough money or if they live more in a like an apartment, they can't afford the storage. A lot of different things. Owning a boat in Japan is very, very expensive. The boats themselves are expensive. The marinas that you got to put them in are pretty expensive as well. And so it adds up. And so a lot of people do not have the luxury of having an actual bass boat in Japan. So a lot of the anglers are forced to do okapari. There is, on any given day, there could be hundreds of guys fishing okapari, all spread out throughout the entire lake. The lake's giant and it has a lot of shore access to it. And so there's been plenty of times where, I have this vision like, okay, I'm going to go fish this very specific spot. I really hope nobody's there. And then you show up and there's somebody there and you're like, well, if I knew somebody was going to be here or if there was a group of people fishing this entire stretch, I would have gone to a spot that's like an hour and a half walk further north or further south. And so it's kind of just a gamble every time I go and do the okapari missions. However, I grew up fishing okapari. I grew up fishing the local urban spots. And you realize pretty quickly, like, dude, this shit is tough. Like if you can catch fish from shore at the tough urban spots, I look at you as like, that guy is a hammer. He knows that he's fishing a terrible, terrible body of water. And he also has to be limited to shore access. Like, the odds are stacked against you. But if you put in the time and effort, I think if you can catch him from shore or from an urban spot, like, I think the reward is so much more than catching them at a lake. When I go down to my local urban spot, if I caught a 2 or 3 pound bass, I would be absolutely stoked. However, if I caught that same 2 or 3 pounder at my local lake, I'd be bummed. I'd be like, holy crap, this fish is so small. Like, why did it even bite my lure? But it comes down to the fulfillment and the reward that you get out of catching a fish. And so, that 2 or 3 pound urban fish, when I do catch them, which is pretty rare, I'm always super, super stoked about it. And so that feeling transfers over to Lake Biwa. However, with Lake Biwa, you have the chance of catching 7, 8, 9, 10 teener class fish from shore. And I think that's what captivates me so much, is that I love shore fishing, but here at my local spot, if I catch a 4 or 5 pounder, that's probably the biggest I'll catch. But in Lake Biwa, the average fish that you probably catch from shore on a swimbait is 4, 5, 6, 7 plus pounds. So it's really, really, it really just drives me insane knowing, like, dude, on any given one of these casts down a tree, down a dock, or anything like this, I could just catch a double digit from shore. And I can't really do that at my home lakes. And so I just find it super, super cool that Lake Biwa sets up perfect for both a guy that has a boat and a guy that doesn't have a boat. Obviously, if you're shore fishing, it becomes 10 times harder because you just cannot reach some of those places, especially like this time of year. Now, this last trip, and every time I go in that fall range, a lot of guys are like, hey, this is like the worst time of year. A lot of those big fish roll off deep and there's not much shallow. And it just becomes a lot harder, especially when you're fishing shallow. There's a crap ton of grass to deal with. However, just like anywhere that fall happens, there's always a transition where the bass will go shallow and they'll go deep. 2 different classes of fish. However, yes, there is a lot of big fish that will pull off during, that fall transition time of year on Lake Biwa into that deeper zone. And you'll see a lot of guys fishing like a big bull flat this time of year on a football head or a deep crankbait. And they're catching these, 9, 10, 11 plus pound fish almost every day on some of that offshore stuff. But a lot of guys feel like the shallow stuff isn't that good. And so this last trip, I kind of felt that firsthand again. However, I caught more fish this last trip than I did any of the trips I've ever done before. Even when I went in April, when it was supposed to be the magical time, I only caught 2 fish. This last trip, I caught 3. The first day of shore fishing, I actually had a really nice fish, maybe 6 or 7 pound fish, eat the Tyrant 8 right at my feet. I mean, that fish was probably in maybe 1.5 feet of water. I honestly did not expect it. I should have probably swung right away, but that thing came out of absolutely nowhere, swallowed that 8-inch tyrant completely, and then by the time I even realized what the heck was going on, I started to spit the bait out and I didn't get a hook in it. And I was super bummed because in my mind, I'm like, okay, I know that shore fishing this time of year is really, really hard. This might be my only bite that I get from shore for this entire trip, and it's my first day. And lo and behold, it was the only bite that I got from shore that entire trip. And so that one bummed me out quite a bit. I'm still bummed about that fish because, again, those shore fish mean a lot more to me than fishing, on a boat with somebody. And so I really felt that one. I hope I get my revenge the next time I go back, but you can't miss your opportunity. You get so little opportunities from shore there that if you do get one, you pray that you actually get a hook in them. So I was really bummed, but it is what it is. And so for the next 2 days after that, I got to fish with my buddy Hot Takuma, which you guys have seen on this channel before, but this time I was actually put on his own channel and we just went fishing out on Lake Biwa, and I actually ended up catching a bass with him on the 8-inch tyrant. So that was a cool one. I mean, I had been wanting to catch a fish on the 8-inch tyrant on Lake Biwa for quite a long time, actually. And to finally actually do it, I was super, super stoked. That fish absolutely smoked it right as soon as I started to do a speed up next to the boat. I watched it eat it, swung right away that time, and I hooked that fish. So I kind of learned from that first bite that I got just like a few days prior. So super stoked on that fish. And that was something that I was like, okay, it seems like these fish are eating the soft bait really good. And now a thing that is kind of like a known thing in Japan is that, like our bass, they don't eat the soft baits good. And so you'll never see a lot of guys throwing soft baits in Japan. It was a big thing maybe like 15, 20 years ago, but there's been a very slow decline. And I understand it because just like here, there's going to be times when they just kind of nip at the soft bait and they don't get it. So I feel like maybe a lot of those Japanese guys, they had that happen to them on whatever soft bait they were throwing and they just wrote it off right away. And that happens here a lot. And basically how I chalk it up in my mind is like, it's just not the right time of year. They're just not eating it good today. And so it is what it is. However, those 2 tyrant bites that I got, they absolutely smoked that bait. I mean, that thing was gone, just boom, in their crushes right away. And so it just really comes down to time of year and just figuring out the cadence and all this other different stuff to get those fish to actually really commit to the bait. And so I was just like, okay, they're eating this soft bait really, really good. So then I switched over to the Clash 9 for the later part of the trip, and I fished with my buddy Hibiki Sammy. You guys should have seen that last video. I'll leave a link to it up here if you guys haven't seen it yet. But I ended up catching 2 fish with Hibiki on the K9 that day, and I had 2 other bites. So that day I had 4 bites and I only landed 2, but that was one of those days where the fish were just juiced. However, they were juiced and they were biting the bait, but they weren't eating the glide bait how they were way back in March or way back in April. Like those fish in April, like the one that I caught out of that tree, I watched that thing completely eat the front half of my K9. However, this last trip, that day, what would happen is those fish would come up and like have their mouths like halfway open and kind of just bite it. Like they were not crushing it. They were just doop and then gone. And I was like, this is weird. Like normally this doesn't happen. Normally they just smoke that glide bait. Watch them just come up and T-bone and crush it. That was not the case this trip. And so I was like, okay, so they're eating the soft bait incredibly well, but they're being really weird about the glide bait. And so seeing that behavior, I was like, okay, maybe I see why guys will run bigger treble hooks on some of their hard baits, because I still run pretty small hooks on my stuff, and all the Japanese guys are like, whoa, don't you think those hooks are a little too small? And you're like, it's fine if they eat it correctly. Well, I found out that I guess I see why they go with like a size 1, a 1-aught, a 2-aught. So when those fish do those weird bites where they kind of just half-ass bite it, if they've got those bigger hooks, they can at least try and get a hook in them. And it seems like that's the case for a lot of those fishing out there. So I was like, okay, I can see. I've always wondered why they ran such big hooks, but getting those bites that I had that day, I can see why. And so those fish, they are pressured. However, I just think it just comes down to a time of day, time of year, so on and so forth. So you kind of have to stay on top of it and learn the different cycles that the fish will go through and their behavior to figure out, hey, what's the best choice to go with for this time of year or for this lure or for that. And so learning that these past however many trips I've gone to Biwa has been an absolute treat, learning more and more about the lake. And I think once I move to Japan, I'll have at least a good starting point of like, all right, here's how I should approach this time of year or this time of year or this time of year, just to kind of get my footing. And right now I feel okay on a lot of the spots that I have around South Lake. I still need to spend a lot more time on North Lake. One of the days I was there on this last trip, I actually spent going to this island called Okishima. And it's like this big main lake island up on North Lake. And the way to get there, at least for me, was to walk from my Airbnb to a train station. From the train station, you end up at another train station. From that train station, you get on a bus. From that bus, you take that bus to a spot where you get on a ferry. From the ferry, you take that to a little marina, and then you can fish the island. There's a whole, I don't know if I just showed you guys or whatnot, but it's a process to get there. But it was cool that a guy fishing that doesn't have a boat can access an island like this that has a lot of giant bass around it. There's been a lot of big fish in that area. It's a very popular area. So to be able to at least access the island was really cool. I didn't catch any fish. Of course not, because it's still Lake Biwa at not a great time of year. However, it was a grind, obviously, but it was cool just to get out on the island and just see what it's like to fish it. Now, a lot of the Okapari stuff you guys will see is a lot of it is an absolute pain in the ass to do. And on that island was no exception. As I was making my way around one of the bends of the island, I actually had to hike up the mountain and hike back down. And that was an absolute trek. Trying to do that with my backpack, all the water, the food that I had, the 7'10" rod with the frenzy title. It was an absolute mess, but it was a learning thing to never do that ever again, because my God, that mountainside kicked my ass. But again, you learn and you live and you learn, right? So Okapari fishing, boat fishing, both of them, I think on that lake can be really good at certain times of the year. You just have to go. And so I've learned a lot about the lake, my trips, talking with certain people, and my heart is completely in 100% with fishing in Lake Biwa. However, in September, I got to fish a couple different other lakes. Another very, very famous lake called Ikehara, and its sister lake called Nanairo. Now, at Ikehara, unfortunately, again, I didn't catch any fish. I had lots of bites on that Tyran 8 that I was fishing. However, they were biting it how like a lot of the Japanese guys say they bite the soft bait, where they kind of bite the back half and that's it. But it just came down to time of year. I was a month early, and so they were just biting it weird. But we got to fish with Imakatsu's pro staff Mihara, and it was cool just to see Lake Ikehara. You know, it's the second most famous lake in Japan for sure. But what was cool was to go to the sister lake called Nanairo. Now, for those that don't know, Nanairo, and a lot of people actually don't know this, Nanairo in 2010 pumped out a 20-pound largemouth that has just gone completely under wraps. A lot of people don't know about this fish, but just like a hair over 20 pounds. And apparently it is the biggest fish ever caught in Japan on an artificial. It came off of a swim bait. All the other two ones, the Lake Biwa one and Shimada Satan's one, with Shimada Satan's, I believe his was only a 19 out of Ikehara. So realistically, that Nanairo fish is the second largest fish ever caught out of Japan. And it's a fish that really nobody knows about. I don't think a lot of people over here know about it. I think a decent amount of guys in Japan know about it, but definitely not American guys. So it was cool finding and diving deeper into like, whoa, there's like this hidden mystery 20-pound bass caught in Japan. Like, I had no idea about it, and it was cool. I mean, it's such a giant fish. So we got to fish Nanairo. Now, why does Ikehara and Nanairo have such giant fish? Well, those fish originally came from a Southern California lake called Lower Otay. And Lower Otay is known for having giant bass, these long, big head, Florida strain fish. Mike Gilbert's 17-pounder was caught out of Otay. I know that fish was caught again when it was 13. I know a handful of other giant bass that were caught out of Otay as well. And so you take those genetics and you put them in these lakes across the ocean in Japan, and they grow the same exact way. They have a lot of forage in those lakes, from bluegill to different kinds of trout to ayu to ugui, like a lot of big bait fish that these fish are feeding on, and so it helped grow a lot of these giant fish. Fishing on Nanairo, I got to see that same behavior that I saw the day before at Ikehara, where I was throwing an imakatsu javelin, and they were just biting the back half of the bait.
Oh, eat it, please. Oh my God, bite it. Oh my God, no way. Oh my God. Wow, 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 wow. Yosha! Yatta! Beautiful, beautiful bass. Nanairo. Kakui. Yeah.
It's so they were absolutely smoking the bait, but they just were not getting hooked, and I was getting very, very frustrated. So I ended up tying on a stinger, and I caught a fish that I didn't even need a stinger for. So it was cool fishing that lake and understanding like, whoa, this is so different than Lake Biwa. It's just very vertical, a lot of overhanging trees, a lot of shaded pockets. Like, it was a very, very cool lake, and I really want to spend more time on that lake. Saw a lot, and I mean a lot of giant bass, both on Ikehara and Nanairo. You would see schools of like 6 to 8 bass, and they're all like 10 pounds and over. Like, you're like, holy crap, there's a lot of big ones here. And oh, there's more big ones here. Oh, that tree had like a bunch of big ones. Like, those lakes are filled with giant bass. And so to spend more time fishing that lake, those two bodies of water would be a lot of fun. They're quite a ways away from Lake Biwa, but it's a lake that I really want to spend more time in. Whether or not I catch true giant bass out of it or the world record out of it, who knows? But I just want to spend more time on cool bodies of water like that in Japan. This video is getting pretty long. It's starting to get dark, so I'm going to wrap it there. If you guys want to know more, I can go so much further in depth with Biwa or Ikehara, Nanairo, or any of the other bodies of water. I can go much deeper down. So just let me know if you guys want to know more about Japan bass fishing as a whole. Just with a comment down below, and maybe I'll do like a part 2 to this video. Other than that, thank you guys ever so much for watching, and as always, go out there and chase your dreams.